Stonehenge today is one of Britain's most famous landmarks and arguably one of the most mysterious and famous Stone Age landmarks anywhere in the world. It's known and revered by millions, many of whom include it on their bucket list of things to see before they die. All around this wide landscape are ancient structures dating back many thousands of years before the early days of Stonehenge's construction. It was and still is by many regarded as sacred landscape. So surely nobody would ever consider it a good idea to use this place as somewhere to land aeroplanes in the middle of a long, bloody and grueling war. Well, they did, and this is that story.
This is Salisbury Plain, an area of chalk downland that was probably relatively clear of woodland back in Neolithic times, when much of the rest of the British Isles were covered in trees and forests. Now, it may have been this strange natural characteristic that drew the earliest human communities in this part of the world to see this landscape as a good canvas on which to build and erect some of their most sacred monuments. You've got a large cursus, a small cursus, a healthy sprinkling of burial mounds, the odd singular standing stone, and several burial pits containing pottery, animal remains and deer antlers, the type used by Stone Age people to dig the earth and work the land into these curious constructions. And all that's before about 2500 BCE, when a ring ditch and an inner and outer bank was slowly transformed into this, a huge stone circle we know today as Stonehenge. So throughout history, this landscape has held whoever controlled this land in awe. It survived the Romans, the Saxons, the Norse invasions, and over 2 centuries now of industrialisation. And all that time, it's also survived several thousand years of changes in land ownership and animal agriculture. So it certainly comes as a surprise to many visitors here to learn that one period that left a very big mark on this landscape was the early 20th century, when an aerodrome was constructed here, right next to Stonehenge, with the aim of serving Britain's wartime air ambitions when aerial combat was still a novel concept. Now, the war I'm talking about, of course, is the First World War, but the military presence in this area actually dates back much earlier than that, to 1897-98, when military training exercises were first carried out on Salisbury Plain. After that time, the Ministry of Defence began buying up vast areas of land in this part of Wiltshire for training and research. This actually went on all the way up until the beginning of the Second World War, and today the MOD owns around 390 square kilometres of land here. That's about half the entire area of Salisbury Plain, making it the largest military training area in the UK. But let's digress, because as well as the odd military exercise here, the other aspect of military presence was reconnaissance ballooning, which had begun in the 1880s. Now, this came with the very positive side effect of allowing photographs to be taken of Stonehenge from an aerial vantage point for the very first time, like this one from the summer of 1906, looking north. In 1909, a civil pioneer by the name of Horatio Barber rented a strip of land just north of Stonehenge to fly his plane from. This was soon adopted by the MOD and became Lark Hill. And in 1911, when the balloon section was expanded into an air battalion encompassing airplanes, it established a presence here, later to become part of the Royal Flying Corps, a precursor to the Air Force. By the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, Britain had been quite slow to see the attacking capabilities of fixed-wing aircraft, instead tending to see them as purely reconnaissance machines. Dropping bombs was seen as more suited to balloons and airships, and the growing threat of German Zeppelins over Britain seemed to back that up. But by 1917, Germans were sending planes to not only to defend the Zeppelins, but to take over some of the bombing duties. German Gotha bombers were quick and had forward and rearward mounted guns for attacking Allied planes. In a sudden frenzy to catch up, the MOD poured resources into developing planes, focusing mostly on bombers. To do that, they needed more airfields from which to get them into the air and into combat. But there was also a sudden drive to get more men signing up as pilots, and many actually did so, seeing the glamour of this daring new technology, as well as seeing it as a good way to avoid the horrors of trench warfare. But training pilots also meant more airfields, and there was just no time to be picky. Sites up and down the country were taken over by the MOD, and once again their eyes fell upon Salisbury Plain. A site was picked out over here, a 360-acre area just southwest of Stonehenge itself. Work began in late 1917 and it was officially completed by November that year, although it didn't really become operational until January 1918. The aerodrome was split into two camps. The day camp down here, straddling what is today the A303, was the main concentration of buildings including offices and accommodation. The night camp was further up here, closer to the present day visitors centre, and included two huge hangars for the Handley Page bombers. The night camp, supposedly for the training of those specialising at nighttime flying, wasn't actually finished by the end of the war in November 1918. Now, the main role of the number 1 school here at Stonehenge was to be a kind of finishing school for pilots before they were sent off to the Western Front. The aim was to train about 60 day and 60 night bombers on courses lasting roughly a month. The men were taught how to fly in formation, navigation using landmarks, cloud flying, and bomb dropping. There was even a test called the head in a bag, which is pretty much what it sounds like. Once airborne, a bag was placed over the pilot's head for 9 minutes per course, in order to test his ability to fly in a straight line. Deviate by more than 15 degrees, and it was a fail. All this sounds quite extreme and a little rushed, but it was vital training at a time when flying on the front lines was perilous work. Most pilots killed in combat environments were not actually shot down, but died simply because flying was hazardous, and there was no time to gain experience and hone the skill. Life at Stonehenge Aerodrome for pilots wasn't exactly dandy either. Pilots complained of a poor quality airfield and poor living conditions. According to one pilot, exquisitely named Cyril Box, "Nobody liked Stonehenge camp and everybody was glad that the course was a short one. Our whole object in life was to get away again, although it was the last school and meant that the next place would be France." As well as the airfield, a light railway was also installed during the war, branching off the line over here at Amesbury and heading first to Lark Hill, then to Rollstone Camp, where there was a balloon school, and then it headed south to Stonehenge Aerodrome. The line closed not long after the aerodrome in 1923, and all trace of it was quickly removed from the landscape.
Right, so to give you the bearings from the ground, if you ever visit here, I'm in a field adjacent to Stonehenge's field. That's the main road over there, very noisy, heading east towards London. And Stonehenge itself, the monument, is between those two white vans there. It's not very far away, it's stone's throw. The airfield itself was in this field, and also most of the buildings associated with the aerodrome were on the other side of the main road over there in the fields. It's not perfectly flat, but it'll do. It'll do for what was needed in a wartime environment, wartime emergency, if you like.
Today, there are only a handful of small archaeological remains of the aerodrome left to find, the most impressive of which is this, thought to be the remains of an underground fuel storage tank, now filled in. Today, seeing how close the standing stones actually are to the airfield, it's amazing that there wasn't any damage caused to them while the aerodrome was here. Well, this was actually an issue from before it opened, with many voices of concern growing louder and louder, especially once the war was over. In 1921, the last aircraft left the site and, bowing to pressure to return the site to peaceful use, the aerodrome was closed 1 year later. For a while, many of the buildings were kept as is, the hangars used for pig farming. But thankfully by 1921, the Stonehenge Protection Committee was set up and the land bought and handed over to the National Trust. The monument might have been protected from further military intrusion, but the rest of Salisbury Plain only became more and more important throughout the 1920s and 30s. Lark Hill grew to be a small garrison town, used primarily for artillery practice. There's also a huge barracks at Bulford, a massive training camp at Tidworth, a barracks at Waterloo Lines, an urban warfare training facility at Cope Hill Down, an airfield at Keyville, a military aircraft testing site at Boscombe Down, and a super secret and controversial chemical testing facility at Porton Down. The latter two not technically within Salisbury Plain.
Now, whether these various military sites in the area have caused damage to any other monuments or burial grounds on the plains remains unknown. Unlikely, but not impossible. But it was the decision to remove the aerodrome from the doorstep of Stonehenge that triggered a new era of preservation in this wider landscape. It offered conservationists and historians an opportunity to think about how far the influence of Stonehenge should reach. Should it just go to its field boundary and the rest is fair game? Or should things be built right up until the very doorstep of Stonehenge, like we see in places like the pyramids of Giza? Or should Stonehenge be preserved at its most awe-inspiring, seen in the context of a wider, open, more untouched Salisbury Plain?